Hum of the fluorescent lights was a familiar companion, a steady, low thrum against the late-night quiet of the office. My world, for these hours, narrowed to the luminous rectangle of my screen, a tapestry woven from numbers and formulae. Each cell, a tiny universe of data, meticulously cross-referenced, reconciled, and ultimately understood. I, Thomas, found a quiet sanctity in this precision, a refuge from the unpredictable chaos of the world beyond these glass walls. My role as a forensic accountant was less about discovery, more about affirmation, ensuring the intricate financial machinery of our prestigious clients ran without so much as a whisper of friction. Tonight, however, a whisper had begun. I was deep within the labyrinthine ledgers of a new high-profile client, a global logistics conglomerate known for its seamless operations and impenetrable data security. My task was a routine quarterly audit, a ceremonial blessing of their financial integrity. It was meant to be unremarkable, yet tucked away in the sprawling appendix of an offshore subsidiary's statement, a single entry snagged my attention like a loose thread in a meticulously woven garment. A transfer, a sum just shy of 7 figures, marked simply as operational adjustment. My brow furrowed. Operational adjustments were common, but never this large, never so vaguely categorized, and certainly never routed through a microbank in a distant island nation I barely recognized. It was an aesthetic flaw, a smudge on the otherwise pristine canvas of their finances. My fingers, accustomed to the ballet of keystrokes, paused. Just an oversight, I murmured to the empty office, the words feeling thin and unconvincing even to my own ears. My internal compass, however, was already twitching. It wasn't the sum itself that bothered me, it was the texture of it. Too clean. Almost aggressively so, yet undeniably out of place. Like a single, perfectly smooth stone amidst a field of jagged rocks, I initiated a deeper dive, pulling up transaction histories, beneficiary records, and internal memos, the digital breadcrumbs that charted the life of every dollar. The firm's proprietary software, usually a swift and obedient servant, seemed to drag its feet, each query taking a fraction longer than it should. My patience, a well-honed tool. Held firm, I traced the 7-figure sum backward, then forward, watching its digital migration. It moved from the client's main account, through a series of shell corporations with names like Horizon Holdings and Viridian Ventures, names generic enough to be invisible, yet too poetic for legitimate enterprise, before settling into the microbank. From there, it dispersed into smaller, round-number payments, disappearing into a fog of untraceable digital wallets. This was no operational adjustment. This was a deliberate act of obfuscation. The precision with which the money was splintered, the immediate erasure of its trail, it bespoke not of error, but of intent. My fingers flew across the keyboard now, driven by a growing urgency. Nothing. They were ghosts, created solely for this purpose, then dissolved. The beneficiaries of the smaller payments were equally opaque, numbered accounts, untraceable digital aliases. The air in the office, usually a cool, controlled environment, seemed to thicken around me. A tremor, barely perceptible, ran through my hands. This wasn't a glitch in the system, it was the system, working exactly as intended, but for an illicit purpose. The initial 7-figure anomaly was merely the first thread of a much larger, more sinister tapestry. My gaze, usually fixed on the luminous grid of my monitor, drifted for a moment to the window. Far below, beyond the glass canyons of the financial district, a distant industrial sprawl shimmered under the city haze. I could almost imagine the vast network of the freight train yard, switching station, a place of silent, colossal power, where steel behemoths reshuffled the world's goods. It was a stark contrast to my world of digits, yet in that moment, it felt like a mirror, reflecting the immense, unseen currents I was beginning to trace. Just as those trains moved physical commodities across continents, these phantom funds were moving illicit wealth, quietly, efficiently, beyond the reach of scrutiny. Had I overanalyzed? Was this simply an elaborate, if clumsy, error by some junior accountant, perhaps a legitimate, if unconventional, investment strategy by a client who preferred discretion? But then, the evidence, stark and unyielding, pulled me back. The pattern was too consistent, the obfuscation too thorough, the sums too significant. This wasn't clumsiness, it was mastery. I pulled up the client's overall financial statements, expanding my search parameters, and there it was, not a single 7-figure anomaly, but a cascade of them, smaller, more subtly disguised, spread across various subsidiaries over the past 2 years. The total began to climb, staggering into the hundreds of millions. My breath hitched. This was not a simple accounting error. This was a sophisticated, large-scale money laundering operation, woven into the very fabric of one of our firm's most prominent clients. The implications hit me with the force of a physical blow. A prestigious firm, unknowingly or perhaps knowingly facilitating an international crime syndicate. A knot tightened in my stomach. The pristine sanctity of my numerical world had shattered, replaced by the grim reality of a truth I could not unsee. The hum of the fluorescent lights, a steady thrum against the late-night quiet, now felt like a buzzing accusation. My world for those hours had narrowed to the luminous rectangle of my screen, a tapestry woven from numbers and formulae. Each cell, a tiny universe of data, meticulously cross-referenced, had whispered its secret, a truth I now held like a shard of ice in my palm. The firm, a titan of financial integrity, was a hollow vessel, its core eaten away by a parasitic scheme. The morning light, when it finally seeped through the tinted windows, offered no solace. It merely illuminated the stark reality of my discovery. I had spent the pre-dawn hours meticulously compiling a summary, a concise narrative of the numerical anomalies, the phantom transactions, the elaborate shell corporations blooming like toxic fungi across international ledgers. My fingers had moved with a surgeon's precision, each keystroke a testament to the undeniable pattern I had unearthed. This wasn't a clerical error, it was a carefully constructed labyrinth, designed to obfuscate the flow of illicit wealth. I clutched the discreetly bound report, a slim folder that felt heavier than lead, as I walked towards the office of the senior partner. My steps were measured, my breath shallow. This was a clear ethical breach, a stain on our firm's reputation, and I, Thomas, the meticulous number cruncher, was the one to expose it. The senior partner's office was a sanctuary of polished mahogany and hushed ambition. Sunlight, filtered through Venetian blinds, striped the Persian rug. He looked up from his own screen, a faint smile playing on his lips, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Thomas, early bird as always. His voice was smooth like river stones. I laid the folder on his expansive desk, positioning it carefully between his silver pen holder and a stack of quarterly reports. "Sir, I've uncovered something significant during the review of the Horizon Ventures account. It warrants immediate attention." His gaze, keen and unblinking, flickered from my face to the folder. He picked it up, his fingers brushing the embossed firm logo. He opened it, flipping through the executive summary, his brow furrowing almost imperceptibly. I watched his face for any flicker of shock, any sign of shared alarm. There was none, only a practiced stillness. "Horizon Ventures," he mused, his voice a low rumble. "A complex client, certainly, high value, high risk, as we discussed." He leaned back in his leather chair, the leather creaking softly. "And what precisely have you found, Thomas, that requires such urgency?" I launched into my explanation, my voice calm, precise, detailing the circular transactions, the inexplicable surges of capital through dormant accounts, the untraceable origins. I spoke of the offshore entities, the mismatched invoices, the sheer scale of the financial sleight of hand. My evidence was bulletproof, each point supported by the data within the folder. He listened, his chin resting on his hand, eyes half closed. My eye for detail is unmatched in this firm, however. He paused, picking up a gold-plated letter opener and turning it slowly in his fingers. These high-level international accounts, they often present unusual patterns. What might appear irregular to the uninitiated eye is often merely a sophisticated, albeit unconventional, tax strategy. The numbers don't lie, they scream it. He offered a tight, almost pitying smile. The numbers, Thomas, can often be interpreted in various ways, and sometimes, in our zeal to uncover wrongdoing, we might overinterpret. Our firm has a reputation to uphold, a trust with our clientele. Unfounded accusations, even internally, can be tremendously damaging to the firm and to the careers of those involved in making them. The words hung in the air, a silent, barbed hook. Unfounded accusations, damaging to careers. My own meticulousness, my dedication to truth, was being twisted into a liability. It didn't add up. His dismissal was too easy, too smooth, too rehearsed. The evidence I presented was overwhelming. Yet he treated it as a minor inconvenience, a misinterpretation of a junior accountant. This wasn't just about protecting a client, this was about protecting something within the firm. I assure sir, I began, my voice strained. I have triple-checked every entry. The anomalies are systemic, not isolated. He waved a dismissive hand. Leave the file with me, Thomas. I'll have a senior team member, a more experienced hand in these complex international structures, review it. Quietly, of course. No need to alarm anyone unnecessarily. In the meantime, I suggest I return to my other priority assignments. Perhaps a fresh perspective will clarify things for I. His gaze held mine, firm, unyielding. We value loyalty here, Thomas, and discretion. They are paramount to our continued success. My chest tightened. Discretion. That was the key. The corruption wasn't just with the client, it had seeped into the very foundations of the firm, reaching higher than I had dared to imagine. The senior partner, a man I had respected, was either complicit or deeply compromised. I nodded, unable to articulate the storm raging within me. The folder, my carefully constructed edifice of truth, remained on his desk, a silent testament to my failure. As I walked out, the polished mahogany and hushed ambition of his office felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. The city outside was a blur of motion, but my own movements felt leaden. The weight of his words, the veiled threat, pressed down on me. I drove aimlessly, the concrete canyons of the financial district giving way to the grittier edges of the city. I needed air, space, something real and tangible to anchor myself against the intangible rot I had uncovered. Without conscious direction, my car found its way to the perimeter of the freight train yard, switching station. The vast expanse of steel tracks, crisscrossing like tangled arteries, stretched into the gray distance. Towering gantry cranes, skeletal giants against the sky, moved with slow, deliberate power, lifting brightly colored containers from flatbed trucks to waiting rail cars. A distant whistle pierced the industrial din, followed by the deep, resonant groan of a massive locomotive. A long freight train, a colossal serpent of articulated metal, began to move, its wheels grinding against the rails, a rhythmic, inexorable clanking that vibrated through the very ground. Each container, a sealed box of unknown contents, rattled past, a procession of anonymous wealth. I watched them go, a silent parade of commerce, and suddenly a thought clicked into place. These containers, these trains, they were the veins and arteries of a global network, a physical manifestation of the very digital pathways I had traced on my screen. The money I had followed, the illicit funds, they weren't just numbers. They were tangible assets, moved and hidden within these very boxes, shipped across borders, laundered through the legitimate flow of goods. I was a single man against this behemoth, a solitary observer staring into the maw of an industrial beast. They hadn't dismissed my evidence because it was weak. They had dismissed it because it was true, and they wanted it buried. A gust of wind whipped across the tracks, carrying with it the faint, acrid smell of burning oil. I pulled my jacket tighter, my hands shoved deep into my pockets. The senior partner's words echoed, "We value loyalty here, Thomas, and discretion. But what about truth? What about justice?" I was alone in this, a solitary figure against a vast, intricate web of corruption. But the numbers, my numbers, still screamed their truth. I just needed to find another way to make them heard. Complicity. The word echoed in the hollow chamber of my thoughts, a silent bell tolling a dirge for my trust. The senior partner, a man whose stern gaze and silvered temples I had once associated with unshakable integrity, was either tangled in this web or utterly blind. Neither prospect offered solace. The firm, once a fortress of meticulous order, now felt like a gilded cage, its bars forged from deceit and silence. My chest had tightened then, and the constriction hadn't truly eased. The air in my small flat felt heavy, thick with unspoken questions. The city outside my window hummed with its indifferent rhythm, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing within me. Discretion, the senior partner's voice had resonated, a silken threat. But discretion, I understood, was a euphemism for complicity, a quiet burial of truth. I couldn't bury this. To turn away now would be to become part of its silent, predatory current. My own investigation began not with dramatic gestures, but with the quiet click of a mouse, the hushed rustle of old documents. I searched for anomalies beyond the obvious, for the subtle tremors that hinted at deeper tectonic shifts. My initial focus, had been on the direct transfers, the opaque shell corporations. Now I sought the physical manifestation, the points where the river of money touched the solid ground of goods and services. One pattern, faint as a moth's wingbeat, began to emerge. A series of logistics companies, ostensibly legitimate, with unusually high volumes of interstate shipping, often through a specific regional hub. Their financial flows were a dizzying ballet of small, frequent transactions, expertly designed to evade scrutiny. Yet cumulatively, they swelled to torrents. The destinations were often unremarkable, but the types of goods declared, when cross-referenced with the declared values, occasionally snagged my attention like a burr on a fine suit. High-value electronics listed as industrial components, precious metals disguised as scrap. It was a subtle sleight of hand, a magician's trick performed on a grand scale. My intuition, a quiet hum that had guided me through countless ledgers, began to vibrate with urgency. I needed to see this place, this nexus point. I needed to witness the physical world where these phantom transactions took solid form. The freight train yard switching stations sprawled under a bruised twilight sky, a metallic behemoth exhaling diesel fumes into the cooling air. The ground vibrated with the distant rumble of engines, a low, guttural growl that permeated my bones. Steel tracks, glinting like silver serpents, crisscrossed the expanse, disappearing into the hazy distance. Towering gantry cranes, skeletal giants, stretched their necks towards the heavens, their hooks poised to pluck containers from the earth. The air, thick with the scent of oil, iron, and damp earth, tasted of industry and forgotten things. I parked my vehicle a discreet distance away, nestled among a cluster of derelict trucks, their paint peeled and faded like old photographs. From my vantage point, the sheer scale of the operation was overwhelming. Trains, long as city blocks, shunted and groaned, their couplings clanging with a jarring percussion. Workers, tiny figures in the vast panorama, moved with practiced efficiency, directing the mechanical ballet. My gaze, however, was not on the general chaos, but on a specific cluster of activity. The logistics company I had identified, Apex Logistics, had a dedicated section, marked by faded banners on a series of storage containers. I had expected a bustling hub, perhaps a few forklifts. What I observed was different. The activity was strangely subdued compared to the general frenzy of the yard. Fewer vehicles moved in and out of their designated zone, yet the containers themselves seemed to cycle with an unusual frequency. I watched, my eyes aching from the strain of distance and fading light, as a series of unmarked trucks, not bearing the Apex logo, arrived at irregular intervals. These trucks were nondescript, their bodies plain, almost forgettable. They pulled up to specific containers within the Apex section. He carried no clipboard, wore no uniform. He spoke briefly with an Apex employee, a quick, almost imperceptible exchange of words, then gestured towards a particular container. Within moments, a forklift, moving with an almost unnatural swiftness, detached the designated container from its stack. This was the wait that doesn't add up moment. The container, a standard 40-foot steel box, was then loaded onto the unmarked truck. It was too fast, too smooth, too efficient for a routine transfer. There were no manifests exchanged, no visible scans, no formal checks that I could discern. The entire process felt like a quiet extraction, a stealthy removal. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steel plate of my resolve. I focused on the departing truck, trying to catch any identifying marks. The license plate was mud-splattered, obscured, but as the truck rounded a bend, the angle shifted, and for a fleeting second I saw it, a small, almost invisible symbol stenciled near the rear axle. It was a stylized, interlocking knot, the same symbol I had seen buried deep within the metadata of one of the obscure shell companies, a company listed as a consulting firm with no apparent physical presence or legitimate business. The knot tightened in my gut. This wasn't just a money laundering scheme. It was a vast, intricate network, capable of moving not just phantom funds, but physical assets, with a frightening degree of coordination and secrecy. The scale of it was monstrous. My initial estimates, unsettling as they were, had been a fraction of the truth. This operation was a hydra, its head spread across continents, its roots burrowed deep into the arteries of global trade. I was no longer merely uncovering a fraud, I was peeking behind a curtain at something far more dangerous, something that moved with an unseen power, a quiet menace. A sudden flash of light, a flicker from a distant gantry crane, caught my eye. For a split second, I felt exposed, a solitary observer in a landscape of giants. Had I been seen, my breath caught in my throat. I ducked lower, pressing myself against the cold metal of the derelict truck. I was no longer just an accountant. I was a trespasser, an interloper in a dangerous domain. My hands trembled as I started the engine. The roar felt deafening in the sudden quiet of my vehicle. I drove away, slowly, carefully, the image of the interlocking knots seared into my mind. I had found the physical connection, the tangible proof that my numbers were not just a phantom menace, but a very real, very present danger. The gilded cage of the firm now felt like a trap, its bars forged not of ambition, but of deceit, complicity. The word still resonated, a somber chord struck deep within my chest. My trust, a delicate edifice, had crumbled to dust, leaving behind a raw, exposed vulnerability. Yet, beneath the tremor of betrayal, a new resolve began to solidify, hard and cold as winter stone. I had peered too deeply into the abyss to simply turn away. The following days unfurled with a disquieting rhythm. My office, once a sanctuary of numbers and order, now felt permeable, its walls thin as parchment. I found myself instinctively checking the lock on my door more often, my gaze lingering on the mundane details of the hallway, the faint scuff on the carpet, the precise angle of a framed award. Small, almost imperceptible shifts in the everyday fabric began to prickle at the edges of my awareness. A car, a charcoal sedan with tinted windows, seemed to glide past my apartment building with an almost unnatural regularity. I dismissed it, at first, as a trick of an overactive mind, a phantom limb of paranoia. My investigation, once confined to the clandestine hours after the firm closed, now bled into my evenings at home. I pored over digitized ledgers, cross-referencing shipping manifests with shell company transactions, tracing the serpentine flow of funds through a labyrinth of offshore accounts. The scale was immense, the network vast, reaching tendrils into legitimate enterprises, cloaking its true nature in layers of corporate jargon and legal obfuscation. One crisp Tuesday evening, a restless impulse drove me from my apartment. A specific set of shipping container numbers had snagged my attention, hinting at a bottleneck in the usual flow, a deliberate diversion. The coordinates, vague and seemingly innocuous, pointed vaguely towards the industrial outskirts of the city. I found myself driving, not directly to any specific address, but towards the general vicinity, drawn by a magnetic pull of unanswered questions. The air grew heavy with the scent of diesel and rust as I navigated the maze of access roads. Towering stacks of containers, like forgotten monoliths, pierced the twilight sky. The rhythmic clanking of couplers and the distant shriek of a locomotive's horn created a symphony of industrial solitude. I parked my vehicle a discreet distance away, blending into the periphery of parked trucks and dormant machinery. My eyes scanned the desolate landscape, searching for anything out of place, any anomaly in the ordered chaos. And then I saw it. Not a grand revelation, but a subtle discord silhouetted against the pale glow of a distant security light, stood motionless beside a stack of crimson containers. He was too still, too isolated, for the bustle of the yard even at this hour. My gaze sharpened. He wasn't looking at the containers. He was looking in my direction, or rather, at the general area where my car was parked. A sudden sharp realization pierced through the haze of my uncertainty, the charcoal sedan. I had seen it earlier, parked casually by a diner 3 blocks from my apartment. I was no longer merely investigating, I was being investigated. The hunter had become the hunted. I watched him for a long, agonizing minute, a silent tableau under the vast, indifferent sky. He made no sudden moves, no overt gestures. He simply was there, a sentinel of silent menace. My breath hitched. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message, delivered in the stark language of presence. I started my engine, a quiet rumble in the cavernous yard, and slowly, deliberately pulled away. I did not glance back, but the sensation of his unwavering gaze remained, a brand upon my back. The drive home was a blur of heightened senses. My apartment, when I finally reached it, felt less like a refuge and more like a stage. I checked the locks again, more meticulously this time, then swept my eyes across the familiar landscape of my living room. Nothing seemed overtly disturbed. The stack of mail was where I'd left it, the remote control nestled in its usual spot on the coffee table. But then my gaze snagged on a small detail. On my desk, amidst the organized chaos of my financial papers, sat a small, polished river stone. I had never owned such an object. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. It was cool to the touch, unremarkable in its simplicity, yet its very presence screamed intrusion. I had cleared my desk before leaving for the freight train yard. I was meticulous. This stone was not there. This was it. Not a warning, but a confirmation. They knew I was digging, they knew where I lived, and they had been inside. The subtle surveillance, the unsettling encounters, had culminated in this silent, potent gesture. The river stone, a stark, unblinking eye on my private world, was a testament to their reach, a quiet declaration that my life, once so neatly ordered, was now exposed. I was no longer merely uncovering a scheme, I was trapped within its intricate design. A profound sense of isolation settled over me, heavy and suffocating. Had I truly been so naive? My certainty, once a steady flame, flickered. What if I was wrong? What if this was all a terrible misunderstanding? And I was merely a paranoid man chasing ghosts? This was no mistake. This was a challenge. The rusted skeletal remains of ancient locomotives loomed against the bruised sky, their silent forms testifying to journeys long past. I was a phantom amidst the giants, my breath pluming in the chill air of the freight train yard, switching station. The smell of diesel and damp earth clung to my clothes, a stark contrast to the sterile, polished corridors of the firm. My gaze swept over the labyrinthine tracks, the silent carriages waiting like hulking beasts, some emblazoned with unfamiliar foreign markings. I had followed a whisper, a fleeting anomaly in a shipping ledger that had gnawed at me since the senior partner's chilling non-denial. A series of seemingly innocuous freight movements, routed through shell companies I'd meticulously unmasked, all terminating here, in this vast, desolate expanse. What I hoped to find. I wasn't entirely sure: a rogue container, a clandestine exchange, a loose thread. My heart hammered a staccato rhythm against my ribs, not from exertion, but from the raw, exposed nerve of my situation. Complicity. A sudden, shrill vibration tore through the desolate quiet. My phone. The caller ID glowed, my wife's name a beacon of normalcy in this unsettling landscape. "Oh my God, Thomas, you need to come home. Now." Her voice was a frayed rope, on the verge of snapping. The background noise was a frantic, muffled symphony of sobs and urgent murmurs. "What is it? What happened?" My blood turned to ice, the freight yard blurring into an indistinct backdrop. It's the child. She's all right, she's fine, but oh Thomas, it was so close." Him words tumbled out, breathless, punctuated by gasps. He was playing by the old oak near the bird feeder. Just moments before, it fell. Right where she'd been, it just toppled. Fell how? Was it windy? I demanded, my mind racing, already dismissing the mundane. "No, Thomas, not like that. It was anchored. I checked it myself last week. It looked like someone had been at it. The bolts, they were loose, almost unscrewed." Her voice cracked, dissolving into fresh tears. "And then, there was a car, idled at the end of the street, then drove off slowly when I ran out." The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering against the gravel. This was a message, etched in the near tragedy of my daughter's innocent play. My breath hitched, a raw, guttural sound escaping my throat. I ran. I didn't remember the walk back to my car, the drive through familiar streets. My vision narrowed, focused only on reaching them, on confirming with my own eyes that he was truly unharmed. Every red light was an unbearable torment, every slow driver a monstrous obstruction. The tranquil suburban landscape, usually a balm, now felt like a thinly veiled stage for unseen horrors. When I burst through the front door, the scent of lavender and fear hung heavy in the air. My wife was cradling our daughter on the sofa, her face pale, streaked with tears. The child, usually a whirlwind of joyful energy, was quiet, her small hands clutching a plush toy, her eyes wide with a lingering confusion. She looked up at me, her lower lip trembling. "Daddy, my unicorn, it's broken." My gaze followed hers to the crushed remains of a bright pink unicorn lying on the rug. Beside it, the ornate, heavy bird feeder, its metal stand bent, its ceramic basin shattered. The sheer weight of the thing, the damage it had inflicted on the toy, it was a brutal, vivid demonstration of what could have been. I knelt, pulling my daughter into my arms, burying my face in her soft hair. Her small body, so fragile, so precious. A tremor ran through me. This wasn't about numbers anymore. This wasn't about my career or even just my life. This was about them, about the innocent lives I had unwittingly exposed to the venomous currents of my world. My wife had been right. The heavy anchor bolts, designed to withstand gales, were not merely loose. They had been deliberately unscrewed, almost to the point of complete detachment, then just barely rethreaded enough to make it appear secure from a casual glance. A slow, calculated act designed not for immediate collapse, but for a delayed, accidental toppling, and the sedan idling waiting to confirm the message was received. My hands clenched, gripped tight. It simmered, then boiled, transforming into a searing, righteous fury. They had crossed a line. This wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration. They knew I wouldn't stop, and now they had shown me the cost. The suburban peace, once a comfort, now felt like a fragile illusion, easily shattered. The meticulous forensic accountant, the cautious number cruncher, felt a profound shift within him. They wanted a fight, they had one, and I would make sure they regretted the day they ever touched my family. The rules of their game had just changed, and I would learn to play by them, and then I would burn them down. The mangled unicorn, its plastic horn cracked, its vibrant pink fur matted with dust and ceramic shards, still haunted the periphery of my mind. It was a silent testament, a brutal tableau of what could be shattered, what could be crushed. The bird feeder, heavy, ornate, now a weapon in my memory, spoke of a force deliberate and unkind. My hands, usually precise, had trembled as I swept the fragments, not just of ceramic, but of a fragile sense of safety. The thought of my family, their unwitting proximity to this encroaching darkness, tightened a band around my chest, squeezing the very air from my lungs. I had always prided myself on self-reliance, on the meticulous, solitary pursuit of truth through numbers. But the truth now felt less like a clean equation and more like a predatory beast, its shadow lengthening, its hunger growing. I was no hunter. I was an accountant, skilled in deciphering ledgers, not in evading unseen threats. The labyrinth was too vast, its walls too high, its architects too ruthless. My destination was a place of iron and thunder, of rust and forgotten journeys, the freight train yard switching station. The sky above was a bruised canvas of late afternoon gray, mirroring the churning within me. Diesel fumes, thick and metallic, coated my tongue, a taste of industry and decay. The air vibrated with the distant rumble of approaching tonnage, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to shake the very ground beneath my worn shoes. Towering stacks of shipping containers, a mosaic of faded primary colors, formed canyons through which I navigated, their corrugated steel surfaces scarred by weather and time. I spotted him near a derelict caboose, its paint peeled, its windows opaque with grime. He stood with his back to me, a silhouette against the corrugated steel of a warehouse in the distance, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a threadbare jacket. The once sharp lines of his posture, a memory from our shared time poring over financial statements, had softened, slouched by the weight of time and circumstance. The former analyst, his name I deliberately kept unspoken, a ghost of a title, a reminder of the firm's brutal efficiency in excising those deemed inconvenient. He had been brilliant, almost too brilliant, seeing patterns others missed, asking questions others dared not voice. That was his undoing, and perhaps now my only hope. As I approached, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a train shunting cars echoed through the yard, a percussive soundtrack to my apprehension. He turned slowly, his eyes, once alight with intellectual fire, now held a weary cynicism, a guarded flicker. A sparse beard, flecked with gray, framed a face that had aged years beyond our last encounter. "Thomas," he said, his voice a low rasp, tinged with surprise, perhaps even resentment. "Fancy meeting you in the graveyard of forgotten cargo." He gestured vaguely at the rusted tracks, the overgrown weeds pushing through cracked asphalt, still chasing ghosts in the numbers. "Some ghosts are more corporeal than others," I replied, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I kept my distance, a respectful space between us, as if acknowledging the chasm that had opened since his departure from the firm. "I wouldn't have sought you out unless it was urgent and dangerous." A mirthless chuckle escaped him. "Dangerous? My dear Thomas, my life became dangerous the moment I realized the Emperor wore no clothes, or rather, that his clothes were woven from stolen threads." He kicked at a loose stone, sending it skittering across the grime. "What do you want?" I hesitated, searching for the right words, the precise entry point into a story that sounded utterly insane. I found something deep within the firm's accounts, a network of shell companies, an elaborate laundering scheme, international, far beyond anything I've ever seen. His expression remained impassive. A subtle shift in his eyes, a tightening around the jaw told me I had his attention. And you, the meticulous Thomas, decided to go digging where you shouldn't have. It wasn't a question. You always were too honest for your own good. They don't like honesty, Thomas. It complicates their narratives. They tried to bury it, I continued, ignoring his barb. They tried to bury me, threats, veiled at first. Less so my home. I need someone to see this, someone who understands the game, who can expose it. He finally turned to face me fully, his gaze piercing. And you think I'm that someone? The disgraced analyst cast out tainted goods. No one listens to me anymore, Thomas, not since they painted me as a disgruntled fantasist. They painted you that way because you were close, I pressed. Stepping closer, lowering my voice as a distant train horn wailed, a mournful cry across the vast yard. You spoke of irregularities, of certain accounts that never quite balanced, even with creative accounting. But you saw something. I need to know what you saw, and I need you to see what I've found. I pulled out a small, encrypted USB drive from my inner jacket pocket. This contains a fragment, a specific transaction disguised as a commodity futures trade, routed through a seemingly legitimate holding company in the Caymans. But the underlying asset, the volume, the frequency, it doesn't align with market reality. He weighed it in his palm, a tiny piece of plastic holding a universe of corruption. A phantom trade, he mused, a flicker of the old intellectual curiosity returning to his eyes. Clever, but hardly groundbreaking. They use 100 variations of that trick. Not like this, I insisted, my voice gaining urgency. This isn't just one trade. It's a pattern, a thread that, when pulled, unravels a tapestry of transactions linking major financial institutions to shell corporations, all ultimately pointing to a single, much larger entity, an international syndicate. The funds aren't just being laundered, they're being used to finance something else. I suspected then that the director, the man everyone believed was the very embodiment of corporate integrity, was involved. But it seemed impossible, unthinkable. He was untouchable. My breath caught. The director, the man whose reputation was carved in granite, whose word was law within the firm. I had always admired his shrewdness, his unwavering composure. To think he could be implicated, it was a piece of the puzzle I hadn't dared to consider, a possibility that twisted my stomach into knots. The director, I repeated, the name tasting foreign on my tongue. But he was the one who initiated the internal review into my claims. A bitter laugh escaped the former analyst. Precisely. The fox guarding the henhouse, Thomas. I suspected it then but couldn't prove it. My evidence was dismissed. My credibility shredded. They made sure no one would believe a word I said. He turned back to me, his eyes now sharp, assessing. So I risked saying my suspicions about him, the ones that cost me everything, might actually be true. The thought that my own efforts might be confirming his disgraced past, that he might have been right all along, sent a shiver down my spine. If the director was involved, then the conspiracy ran deeper, higher than I had ever imagined. My initial attempts at internal reporting weren't just met with obstruction, they were met with deliberate, calculated misdirection from the very top. I don't know, I admitted, my voice hoarse. But if what I've found, combined with what I suspected, it could be the key. We could expose them. Stared at the USB drive, then back at me. Expose them? I think I can just wave a few documents and they'll crumble. These people don't crumble, Thomas, they crush. If it's true, if he is truly involved. A new light, dangerous and defiant, ignited in his eyes. Then it's a different game entirely. Not just numbers, not just money. It's about power and vengeance. He looked up at the bruised sky, then back at me, a decision hardening his features. I'll look at my fragment. But if I help Thomas, it's on my terms. No more secrets, no half-truths. And if this leads where I think it might, I will be walking into a firestorm. Are I ready for that? I thought of the crushed unicorn, the shattered ceramic, but beneath it, a new resolve had begun to burn, fueled by the encroaching threat to my family, by the sheer audacity of the injustice. I am. He nodded slowly, a grim acceptance. Meet me here again. Same time in 2 days. Bring everything I have. And be careful, Thomas. From this moment on, I ran no longer just an accountant, I ran a target. As I walked away, the vast industrial landscape of the freight train yard switching station seemed to swallow me whole. The rumble of the trains felt less like a distant hum and more like a predator's growl, closer now and utterly inescapable. I had found an ally, but in doing so, I had also deepened the peril, casting a wider net into dangerous waters. The weight of the world, once carried alone, now felt shared, yet no less suffocating. The vast industrial landscape of the freight train yard switching station had promised an ally, but now it merely offered a deeper, more profound sense of isolation. The rumble of the trains, once a distant, predatory growl, had tightened its grip, a visceral tremor in the very ground beneath my worn shoes. Each metallic shriek from the coupling cars, each blast of a distant horn, felt less like the rhythm of industry and more like a warning, a rising crescendo of threat. I walked with purpose, though my destination was as nebulous as the exhaust plumes hanging heavy in the cool evening air. My mind replayed the clandestine exchange, the flicker of information, the desperate hope. But an instinct, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of my resolve. It wasn't the usual paranoia, the low hum that had accompanied me for weeks. This was different, a sudden stark silence in the cacophony of the yard, a stillness that felt profoundly unnatural. The air, thick with the scent of diesel and damp earth, suddenly felt heavier, pressing in. I stopped, my breath catching. The distant shunting of cars, the whistle of a departing locomotive, they all seemed to recede, leaving only the frantic drum of my own pulse. And then, a low, guttural murmur. Not directed at me, but a signal, a confirmation. My head snapped around. Another emerged a moment later, closer to my left flank. They weren't moving quickly, but with a horrifying, measured pace, like hunters cornering their prey. My heart, a trapped bird, beat furiously against my ribs. This was it. No more veiled threats, no more anonymous warnings. This was the consequence, raw and immediate. Thomas, a voice, gravelly and devoid of inflection, cut through the din, amplified by the metal canyons around us. It was not a question, but a statement of possession. Adrenaline surged, a bitter tide washing through me. My feet, seemingly of their own accord, churned into motion. I didn't think, I simply ran. The ground was uneven, a treacherous patchwork of loose ballast stones and embedded sleepers. I sprinted towards a cluster of stationary flat cars, their low profiles offering a momentary hope of concealment. Behind me, the crunching footsteps quickened, punctuated by the heavy thud of boots. My pursuers were not calling out, not shouting. Their silence was more terrifying than any threat. It spoke of absolute certainty, of a task to be completed without fuss or fanfare. I risked a glance over my shoulder. One was powerfully built, his stride long and unyielding. Another, leaner, moved with surprising agility, weaving through the maze of tracks. The third seemed to hang back, observing. I scrambled between a pair of tanker cars, the narrow gap barely wide enough for my shoulders. The reek of residual chemicals was suffocating. My lungs burned, each breath a ragged gasp. Ahead, a series of enormous, covered freight wagons loomed, their sides a canvas of graffiti and grime. They offered more substantial cover, a chance to disappear. As I burst from between the tankers, the lean figure was suddenly there, a phantom of motion, blocking my path. He moved with a brutal swiftness, a hand shooting out to grab my shoulder. I twisted, my body reacting with a desperate, untrained instinct, ducking under his arm. His fingers grazed my jacket, tearing a seam. My momentum carried me forward, a desperate lunge. I stumbled, falling to my knees amidst the sharp gravel, my hands instinctively reaching out to break my fall. As I pushed myself up, something glinted in the dying light. Lying half-buried in the ballast where I had fallen, not a weapon but something else. My fingers closed around it, a desperate, almost unconscious act. It was heavier than it looked, cool to the touch. A data chip, perhaps, or a miniature drive, no time to scrutinize. The lean figure cursed, a low, frustrated growl. I rolled, scrambling under the belly of a stationary boxcar, the oil-slicked undercarriage scraping against my back. The space was tight, claustrophobic, reeking of rust and diesel. I could hear their heavy boots pounding on the gravel above me, their frustrated shouts echoing in the confined space. "He went under," the lean one barked. I crawled, pushing my way through the muck, my clothes catching on unseen snags, my fingers still clutching the metallic object. A tangible piece of my desperate flight felt clumsy and numb. I emerged on the other side, gasping for air, my vision blurring at the edges. A sudden, piercing whistle from a passing locomotive provided a momentary, deafening cover. I used it, launching myself into a full sprint towards the perimeter fence, a flimsy barrier of chain link and barbed wire that seemed impossibly far away. The ground vibrated with the passing train, its enormous wheels a blur of steel and speed. Its deafening roar was a shield, a wall of sound that swallowed my ragged breathing, their frustrated shouts. I could see a section of the fence ahead, twisted and broken, a gaping more in the wire, a gift from this indifferent industrial behemoth. I threw myself at it, scrambling through the jagged opening, tearing my trousers and scratching my leg on the barbed wire. The pain was sharp, but secondary to the burning need to escape. I didn't look back. I finally collapsed behind a forgotten pile of railway ties, far from the tracks, my body trembling, my breath coming in ragged, painful heaves. My fingers, still numb, finally managed to pry it open. It wasn't a chip, but a miniature, folded data card, no bigger than my thumbnail. Etched onto its surface, almost imperceptibly, was a sequence of numbers and symbols. A bank routing number, specific and highly unusual, and then a corporate identifier I recognized from my deepest dives into the syndicate's convoluted financial structure. A direct, undeniable link. My stomach clenched. This wasn't just a clue. It was a smoking gun, ripped from the very hands of my pursuers. I had escaped, but the price was clear. My world had just shrunk to the size of this tiny, incriminating card. There was no going back to the firm, no returning to the ghost of my old life. I was truly underground now, a phantom in the world, with nothing but this dangerous knowledge and the terrifying resolve to use it. I had to see this through, not just for myself, but for everything that had driven me to this precipice. The air tasted of metal and diesel, sharp and unforgiving, mirroring the gnawing chill that had settled deep within my bones. My breath plumed in the cold, a fleeting ghost against the steel behemoths that stood sentinel, indifferent to my plight. I had waited, a statue carved from desperation, until the last flicker of hope had guttered out, leaving me only with the metallic tang of betrayal. The display showed the number of the managing partner, a man whose voice usually carried the smooth, polished cadence of authority and reassurance. Not today, I instinctively knew. This was not a call of comfort. I hesitated, watching the name flash, a warning beacon in the encroaching twilight. Then, with a sigh that felt ripped from my very core, I answered. "Thomas," the voice began, devoid of its usual warmth. "Where are I?" It was the head of the firm, his tone clipped, brittle. "I'm out," I replied, my voice hoarse, the lie tasting like ash, working on a lead. A sharp, humorless chuckle crackled through the line. "A lead, is that what I call it? I read to return to the firm immediately, or rather I were to return. As of this moment, my access has been revoked. My key card is deactivated. My accounts have been frozen." My blood, sluggish moments before, surged with an icy shock. "What are I talking about?" The words felt foreign. "Not my own. We have uncovered discrepancies, Thomas, significant ones, funds diverted, unauthorized transactions, proprietary data accessed and downloaded to external drives, corporate espionage to be precise, and embezzlement." Each word was a hammer blow, shattering the fragile edifice of my professional life. "That's impossible," I breathed, staring blankly at the labyrinthine tracks stretching into the gloom. "I've done nothing of the sort. This is a setup. The evidence is quite compelling," the managing partner continued, his voice now an unyielding wall. "A substantial sum, Thomas, enough to raise eyebrows even in our line of work. And the trail, sadly, leads directly to I. My personal accounts show a sudden, inexplicable influx of capital. My access logs are damning. We've initiated an internal investigation, of course, but the board has already made a preliminary decision. I am suspended, effective immediately. Do not attempt to enter the premises. Legal counsel will be in touch." The line went dead, suspended, framed, embezzlement, corporate espionage. The words echoed in the cavern of my skull, each one a nail driven into my coffin. My personal accounts, a sudden influx of capital. This was the syndicate's work, their cruel, efficient retaliation. My fingers, trembling, tried to dial my wife. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again. Each unanswered ring a fresh stab of fear. Had they gotten to her, or was she simply avoiding me, having already heard the devastating news from some anonymous official source? The thought was a venomous serpent coiling in my gut. My family, my refuge, now a potential casualty, or worse, alienated. I scrolled through my contacts, desperate for an ally, a friendly voice. I settled on a colleague, a junior analyst I had mentored, a bright mind I trusted. The call connected, but his voice was tight, strained. "Thomas, I can't talk right now, I'm really sorry." "Wait," I pleaded, "please listen. This is a mistake, I've been framed, they're watching." "Good luck, Thomas." The line disconnected. "They're watching." The words hung in the frigid air, solidifying the invisible walls that now surrounded me. Not just the syndicate, but my own firm, my former colleagues, perhaps even the authorities. I was a pariah, tainted, an enemy of the state, or at least of the corporation. My eyes scanned the desolate landscape of the freight train yard, switching station. The towering containers, stacked like forgotten dreams, seemed to mark my newfound vulnerability. Each rusted bolt, each weathered plank seemed to hold a secret, a truth I was now barred from uncovering. I tried to piece together the managing partner's accusations. Funds diverted, unauthorized transactions. My mind, trained for years to find the cracks in financial facades, struggled to find a logical entry point. My access logs, he said, were damning, but I had been so careful, so meticulous. Every login, every file accessed, every email sent, it was all recorded, a digital breadcrumb trail I had always assumed would protect me. Then a flicker, a weight that doesn't add up moment, sharp and clear amidst the fog of despair. He mentioned a substantial sum, an inexplicable influx into my personal accounts, but I had been living frugally, saving every spare penny. There was no way such a deposit could have gone unnoticed by me, unless it wasn't a deposit into my account, but a transfer from it, made to look like I was siphoning funds, or a phantom deposit designed to paint me as having illicit wealth. My mind raced, recalling the details of the syndicate's operations I had uncovered. Their method of laundering wasn't about direct transfers to personal accounts. It was about shell companies, layered transactions, and offshore havens. This direct, clumsy framing, while effective in isolating me, felt, beneath them, it was too blunt, too obvious for the sophisticated network I had been tracking, unless it wasn't clumsy at all, unless it was designed to be instantly damning, requiring no complex forensic analysis, just a quick look at the surface. A quick, damning look for those who wanted to believe the worst. My meticulous nature, my greatest strength, was now twisted into a weapon against me. They knew how I worked, how I left digital footprints, and they had used that knowledge to forge a false trail, perfectly mimicking my patterns, yet subtly altering the destination. A wave of nausea washed over me. Had I been so blind, so arrogant in my own abilities that I hadn't foreseen this level of counterattack? The thought of my own potential oversight, however small, was a bitter pill. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, I doubted everything. Had I inadvertently made a mistake, a tiny misstep that they had ruthlessly exploited? The specific amount. He had mentioned a substantial sum. I hadn't caught the exact figure, but it felt familiar. A sum I had seen before, not in my accounts, but in the syndicate's illicit ledgers. A sum linked to a particular transaction. One I had flagged as highly suspicious, but couldn't quite connect to a final beneficiary. This wasn't just a frame, it was a distraction. A clumsy, yet effective diversion designed to keep me from digging deeper into that specific transaction. They weren't just isolating me, they were protecting something. And that something, I realized with a grim certainty, was far more significant than my career. It was the heart of their operation. The cold wind whipped around me, but a different kind of fire began to burn in my gut. They wanted me to despair, to give up, to vanish. But they had underestimated the meticulousness of a forensic accountant scorned. I might be ruined, isolated, and hunted, but I was not broken, not yet. I had nothing left to lose, and that, paradoxically, made me more dangerous than ever before. The freight train yard, once a symbol of my profound isolation, now seemed to transform into a battleground, a starting point for a war I had no choice but to fight. The frigid air of the freight train yard, switching station, clawed at my exposed skin, a relentless bite that mirrored the gnawing in my gut. Steel groaned against steel, a symphony of industry and endless transit, as colossal boxes painted in faded corporate liveries shifted on their tracks. The rhythmic clang of couplers echoed, a metallic heartbeat in the vast, open space, while the distant rumble of an approaching locomotive vibrated through the very ground beneath my worn boots. I was a ghost here, a shadow among giants, the only warmth a desperate ember of defiance flickering within me. Her voice, thin and brittle with fear, still haunted the edges of my hearing. "They are watching." The words were no longer a warning, but a stark, undeniable truth. My firm, once a fortress of professional integrity, was now a viper's nest. My colleagues, once trusted faces, were either complicit or conveniently blind. My life, once meticulously ordered, was now a fractured mosaic of peril and isolation. Every line of communication felt compromised, every familiar street corner a potential trap. I had been stripped bare, left with nothing but the labyrinthine pathways of my own mind. I hunched deeper into the shadows cast by a towering stack of empty containers, the wind whistling a mournful tune through the gaps. The digital ghosts of ledgers, the phantom figures of shell companies, the impossible dance of illicit funds they swirled behind my eyelids, a relentless, intricate ballet of deceit. I'd spent a lifetime dissecting these patterns, finding the cracks where others saw only seamless surfaces. But this network, this syndicate, was a hydra, each had a new layer of obfuscation. My earlier attempts to expose them had only alerted them, tightened their grip, and pushed me to the precipice. A specific set of transactions kept surfacing in my mind, a minor, almost imperceptible tremor in the vast financial ocean I'd been charting. It was a series of small, recurring transfers, always just under the radar, funneled through an obscure offshore entity. Individually, they were negligible, easily dismissed as administrative overhead or minor operational costs. Collectively, they built into a significant sum, but their true anomaly wasn't the total. It was the timing, always on the third Thursday of the month, always between 02:00 and 03:00 GMT, and always routed through a specific, rarely used correspondent bank. Before I'd logged it as an oddity, perhaps a legacy system quirk. It wasn't an anomaly, it was a pulse. A deliberate, rhythmic heartbeat designed to blend into the background noise, a signal hidden in plain sight. Wait, that doesn't add up. No legitimate firm would maintain such a peculiar, rigid payment schedule for minor, variable costs. It was too precise, too mechanical. It wasn't money laundering, it was communication, or more precisely, a trigger. My mind, honed by years of forensic scrutiny, began to construct a counter-narrative. If these transfers were triggers, what did they trigger? And if I could disrupt them or mimic them, what would happen? The syndicate thrived on their invisible operations, their ability to move money and influence without leaving a clear, undeniable trail. My weapon was the truth, the stark, irrefutable evidence of their financial architecture. I envisioned their sprawling network, the origin points, the numerous layers of obfuscation, the ultimate beneficiaries. Every transaction was a line in a vast, interconnected drawing, and every line, however faint, had a beginning and an end. My plan had to be a surgical strike, not a wild swing. It had to target a specific, critical juncture where their digital labyrinth intersected with the tangible world, a point where their carefully constructed anonymity could be shattered. My gaze swept across the endless rows of cargo containers, some sealed, some open, revealing jumbled contents. The movement here was constant, predictable, yet chaotic. Manifests, waybills, shipping schedules, they were the physical world's equivalent of ledgers. What if I could force a specific, financially significant transaction to occur, not in their hidden digital realm, but in a public, undeniable arena? A transaction so brazenly out of place, so glaringly anomalous, that it would scream for attention from legitimate authorities, even those who might be compromised. The key was to exploit their own meticulously designed vulnerabilities. Their strength was their secrecy, their ability to vanish funds into the ether. Their weakness, I realized, was their reliance on control. They needed to know where every dollar was, even if no one else did. If I could introduce a rogue element, a significant sum that appeared to originate from one of their own accounts, but was directed to an entirely unexpected public destination, it would force their hand. They would have to react, to trace, to attempt a recovery. And in doing so, they would reveal their true operational structure, their methods, and most importantly, their key players. The thought was audacious, bordering on suicidal. Could I, a lone accountant, truly orchestrate such a sophisticated financial maneuver against an international crime syndicate and elements within my own firm? Had the stress finally fractured my careful mind? Was I grasping at phantom strategies, driven by desperation? The sheer scale of the network, the ruthlessness I'd glimpsed, threatened to overwhelm me. My hands, usually steady and precise, trembled slightly. But then the image of my family, of the life I was fighting to protect, flashed before my eyes. The fear for them, the crushing weight of their potential peril, solidified my resolve. I had no other path. Surrender was not an option. My plan began to crystallize. I would use the small, recurring trigger transactions as a template, understanding their rhythm and cadence. I would create a phantom transaction, a mirror image of their system, but one designed to boomerang back, revealing its true architects. It would be a digital Trojan horse, carrying within it the indelible proof of their network. I would leverage their own communication protocols, their own methods of obfuscation, to turn their system against them. The freight train yard, with its constant movement of goods and its hidden cargo, provided a potent metaphor and perhaps a physical component to my counter-move. If I could link the digital exposure to a tangible event, a specific container, a timed shipment, it would create an undeniable public spectacle. I would need access, precise timing, and an unwavering nerve. Every step would be a gamble, every move potentially fatal, and that I knew was a price I could never pay. My mind, once solely focused on numbers, was now a weapon, sharp and precise, ready to strike. The game had shifted. I was no longer merely defending. I was attacking. The rhythmic clang and hiss of pneumatic brakes, the distant shriek of a locomotive, all seemed to underscore the precariousness of my existence. A single, fragile life amidst a world of crushing metal and indifferent power. I stood in the shadow of a towering container, its rust-streaked side a canvas of forgotten journeys, my breath pluming white, each exhalation a fragile cloud against the unforgiving night. My fingers, stiff with cold, brushed against the small, cold comfort of the encrypted drive tucked deep within my coat. It held not just data, but a ticking clock, a truth bomb waiting for detonation. This was no longer about numbers on a ledger, it was about lives, including the two most precious to me. The thought of my family, sleeping unaware in their beds, was both a spur and a torment, a fragile shield against the encroaching dread. I had come to this desolate junction, not for freight, but for finality. The plan, meticulously pieced together over sleepless nights, was a delicate house of cards. One wrong move, one misplaced digit, and it wouldn't just collapse, it would explode, taking everything with it. Inside, the sickly glow of screens cast an eerie pallor on the hunched figures. The air hung thick with stale coffee and desperation. I chose a terminal in a dim corner, its keyboard sticky, its mouse unresponsive until coaxed. These were not direct transfers, but a cascade of small, seemingly innocuous movements designed to trip a specific algorithmic flag, a tripwire I had painstakingly engineered. I watched the lines of code unfurl, a language of power and deceit. My eyes scanned for the subtle ripples, the digital echoes I knew would emanate from the syndicate's servers. It was like tuning a radio to a faint, distant signal, knowing that every crackle and hiss could be a clue or a trap. I uploaded a compressed archive, disguised as a routine system update, to a dormant server I had previously compromised within the firm's sprawling network. This file contained a meticulously crafted log, a false trail pointing towards a rival corporation, complete with fabricated IP addresses and timestamps that would send their internal security on a wild goose chase for precious hours. It was a feint, a necessary diversion. Next, the real payload. The encrypted drive hummed as I connected it. The data I needed to manipulate was not just figures. It was the very architecture of their deception, the hidden conduits of their illicit wealth. I began to subtly alter ledger entries, not enough to trigger immediate alarms, but enough to create discrepancies that would become glaring under scrutiny. I shifted dates, reclassified assets, and most crucially, embedded a unique, almost imperceptible digital signature within a batch of seemingly legitimate transactions. This signature, a string of seemingly random characters, was a key known only to me and one other, the detective. It would be his unmistakable proof that the information originated from me, a silent, desperate beacon in the impending storm. My fingers paused, hovering over the enter key. What if I had missed something? A single line of code, an overlooked protocol, a lingering trace they could exploit. The weight of it pressed down, a concrete slab on my chest. My family. The thought was a sharp, physical pain. Had I condemned them with my righteousness? Doubt, a venomous serpent, began to coil in my gut. This wasn't just my life, it was theirs. A single miscalculation and the trap I was setting would spring on us. I shook my head, a fierce internal battle waged and won. There was no turning back. The path was chosen, the die cast. I had to believe in my own meticulousness, my own understanding of their labyrinthine system. I opened an anonymous, encrypted email client, its interface stark and unforgiving. The recipient, a well-known investigative journalist, one whose reputation for fearlessness preceded them. I included a precise timestamp, a countdown to when the full, unredacted truth would be publicly accessible, and a brief, urgent instruction: verify everything, act swiftly, the window is narrow. I hit send. The public reveal was set, a slow-burning fuse lit. Finally, I sent a separate, even more cryptic message to the detective. It contained only a single, obscure reference to a specific regulatory filing from 3 years prior, a document that held the key to deciphering my embedded digital signature. It was enough, I hoped, for him to connect the dots, to understand the true source and the urgency. As I wiped the system clean, deleting every trace of my presence, a strange calm settled over me. The trap was laid. The bait was out. The wire was stretched taut. I walked out of the internet cafe, back into the indifferent night, the city lights blurring into a hopeful yet terrifying haze. My heart, a drum against my ribs, beat a frantic rhythm, counting down to the moment when the world would either break or finally be made whole. The biting wind, thick with the metallic tang of rust and the faint, acrid breath of diesel, whipped at my coat as I stepped onto the uneven gravel. Above, a skeletal latticework of power lines hummed a low, ominous hymn, crisscrossing a sky-bruised purple with the last vestiges of twilight. This was it, the freight train yard, switching station, a sprawling, iron-toothed moor where steel behemoths slumbered on parallel tracks, their silent bulk a testament to the colossal forces they once commanded. My breath plumed white, a fleeting ghost in the cold. I moved with a practiced caution, each footfall measured against the rhythmic clatter of distant shunting. The air here vibrated with a raw, industrial energy, a stark contrast to the hushed corridors of my former world. This was no place for ledgers and spreadsheets, but for the unforgiving grind of heavy machinery and desperate men. My grip tightened on the worn leather of my satchel, its contents a digital key to an empire's unraveling. The message I'd sent, a whisper into the digital void, was now a roaring siren in my mind. The public reveal, a meticulously timed cascade of data, was set to detonate. A single, flickering bulb cast a sickly yellow glow from a low-slung administrative building, illuminating the figure waiting. His silhouette, sharp and unyielding against the gloom, was unmistakable. The executive, his usual impeccably tailored suit now replaced by something darker, less conspicuous, stood with an air of coiled menace. My heart, a relentless drum against my ribs, quickened its tempo, but I forced my gaze to remain steady, my stride unbroken. Thomas, the executive's voice sliced through the din, devoid of its usual polished charm, now a rough-edged rasp. Always the meticulous one, I knew you wouldn't be able to resist a final audit. I stopped a respectful distance away, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. An audit was long overdue, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt, especially when the books tell such a compelling story. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. A story you've embellished, perhaps, a creative accounting, wouldn't you say, for a man desperate for a moment in the spotlight. The numbers speak for themselves. I countered, my eyes scanning the periphery, searching for any sign, any confirmation of my last desperate gambit. Millions siphoned, shell corporations spun like a spider's web, illicit funds flowing through legitimate channels. It's not embellishment, it's arithmetic, pure and damning. One of the enforcers shifted, a quiet rustle of heavy fabric. A glint of metal caught the faint light, a blade, or something similar, tucked into his belt. My breath hitched just for a second. You believe you have leverage, Thomas? The executive's eyes narrowed, reflecting the sickly yellow light. A few leaked documents, a disgruntled employee's desperate cry for attention. We've weathered storms far greater than a misplaced ledger. Not misplaced, I corrected, a tremor of defiance running through me. Deliberately exposed. The public has eyes now, the authorities have been alerted. Foolish boy, you think a few keystrokes can dismantle what we've built. This organization is a leviathan, you are but a plankton. Perhaps, I conceded, allowing a hint of doubt to color my tone, a strategic weakening. But even plankton can clog the gears. And I didn't come alone. That was a calculated gamble, a deliberate misdirection designed to buy me precious seconds. The enforcers too became more alert, their heads swiveling. This was the opening. "You're bluffing," he snarled, his eyes snapping back to me, the brief uncertainty gone, replaced by a predatory certainty. "There's no one else here. Just you, Thomas, and your very, very bad decision." He gestured, a subtle flick of his wrist. The enforcers began to advance, their footsteps heavy on the gravel, closing the distance between us. The air grew thick, electric with unspoken threat. My mind raced, reviewing every contingency. Had the public reveal triggered? Had the detective received the full data package? Especially when it's backed by irrefutable data, meticulously cross-referenced, authenticated, and now widely distributed. Just then, a faint, almost imperceptible ping vibrated against my thigh. It was too soft for them to hear. But for me, it was a lifeline. The public reveal had gone live. The data was out. The fuses were burning. "It's done," I stated, a surge of adrenaline pushing away the doubt. My voice rang with a new, fierce clarity. The entire network, the offshore accounts, the dummy corporations, the names, the dates, the amounts, all of it. It's no longer just in my satchel, it's everywhere. And the authorities, thanks to my final message, know exactly where to look. The executive's face contorted, a mask of fury cracking. "You fool, you've signed your own death warrant." He lunged, a sudden desperate move, surprisingly swift for a man of his stature, aiming for my satchel. But I anticipated it, a lifetime of cautious steps now replaced by instinct. I sidestepped, the heavy satchel swinging away from his grasping fingers. At that precise moment, a siren's mournful wail pierced the industrial din, growing louder, closer, echoing off the towering freight cars. Blue and red lights began to pulse, painting the distant tracks in an urgent, fragmented dance. The executive froze, his eyes widening in disbelief, then a frantic, desperate fear. The enforcers, too, halted their advance, their heads snapping towards the approaching sound. The detective, or at least the law, was here. My cryptic message, a breadcrumb trail through the digital wilderness, had led them directly to this desolate switching station, to this very confrontation. The siren's mournful wail sharpened, a predatory cry slicing through the metallic clang and distant rumble of the freight train yard, switching station. My attacker, a shadow of his former intimidating self, stumbled forward, his fingers clawing at the empty air where my satchel had been. The momentum, once his ally, now betrayed him, sending him sprawling amidst the loose gravel and discarded ties. Then, a flurry of motion. Uniformed figures, dark against the industrial gloom, materialized from the periphery. They were swift, practiced. One officer, a woman with eyes like polished obsidian, pinned the fallen man with a knee to his back, her voice a clipped command I barely registered. Another secured his wrists, the harsh click of restraints echoing the finality of a closing vault. I stood there, breath ragged, the heavy satchel still clutched in my hand, its weight a sudden, comforting anchor. The air, thick with the scent of diesel and damp earth, tasted of iron and triumph. Or was it just relief, cold and sharp, like a sliver of broken glass? A hand, firm and reassuring, settled on my shoulder. It was the detective, his face etched with a weariness that mirrored my own, yet alight with a quiet satisfaction. "Thomas," he said, his voice low, a gravelly murmur against the cacophony of the yard. "It's over." But was it? The truth, once a hidden current, had burst forth, carving a new riverbed through the landscape of my life. The following days blurred into a whirlwind of statements, interviews, and the relentless, hungry gaze of the press. The story exploded, a supernova in the financial world. My name, once a meticulous footnote in audit reports, became a headline, a banner for integrity, and to some, a symbol of ruin. The firm, that venerable institution of glass and steel, crumbled from within. The senior partner, whose pronouncements had once held the weight of immutable law, was led away in handcuffs, his tailored suit now a shroud of disgrace. The manager, whose threats had once felt like suffocating coils, followed, his face a mask of impotent rage. Other executives, their names once synonymous with power and influence, were exposed, their carefully constructed facades shattering under the relentless scrutiny. The evidence I had painstakingly gathered, once dismissed as the paranoid ramblings of a disgruntled employee, now stood as an unassailable testament to their guilt. The vindication was sweet, a cool balm on the raw wounds of betrayal, yet it came at a price. The firm was in shambles, its reputation irrevocably stained, its future uncertain. And I, Thomas, the man who had brought it all down, was left standing amidst the rubble. Our child, too young to fully grasp the tempest we had weathered, clung to my leg, a beacon of innocence in the aftermath. Their safety, the paramount drive behind my desperate journey, was secured, yet the cost gnawed at me. The sleepless nights, the constant vigilance, the transformation from a cautious number cruncher to a resourceful adversary, it had left an indelible mark. My career at the firm, the life I had meticulously built, was gone. I had succeeded, yes, but at what personal expense? Days later, the detective called. His voice over the phone carried the same weary satisfaction as in the train yard. "We've rolled up most of it, Thomas. The international syndicate, or at least this branch of it, is effectively dismantled. The funds are frozen, the key players are in custody across multiple jurisdictions. My information was instrumental." He spoke of intricate financial pathways, of shell corporations dissolving like mist, of illicit gains that would never see the light of day. I listened, my mind, for the first time in weeks, not actively searching for discrepancies, but simply absorbing. He mentioned a name, a minor contact, a fixer in a distant port city who had apparently vanished just before the arrests. A small fish, likely spooked, the detective mused, probably just cut his losses and ran. But as he spoke, a flicker of unease stirred within me. A small fish, yes, but a fish with a specific, fleeting connection to a particular set of offshore accounts I'd seen in the earliest, most convoluted ledgers. Accounts that oddly seemed to have been siphoned off before the main collapse, almost as if someone had been given a premonition. A single loose thread, barely visible, amidst the tightly woven fabric of justice. It didn't quite add up to a full threat, not yet. The world outside my window, now bathed in the soft, forgiving glow of a new dawn, felt different. Cleansed, perhaps, but scarred. I had walked through fire, and while the flames had receded, their heat still radiated from the very core of my being. And I, Thomas, was no longer merely an accountant. I was something else entirely. The raw dampness of the night clung to me, a shroud woven from diesel fumes and the metallic tang of rain-slicked rails. My breath plumed in the frigid air, dissipating into the vast, echoing cavern of the freight train yard switching station. The rhythmic clatter of distant shunting cars, a metallic symphony of industry and departure, seemed to underscore the finality of this moment. I stood by a rusted signal box, its green light casting a sickly glow on the dew-kissed gravel, my gaze fixed on the intricate web of tracks that stretched into the impenetrable darkness. The small fish. The phrase had been a barb, a dismissive flick of the hand from the syndicate's captured lieutenant, meant to trivialize a minor player in their grand scheme. But his words had snagged on something vital within me, a thread leading back to those earliest, most convoluted ledgers. Accounts that oddly seemed to have been siphoned off before the main collapse, almost as if anticipating the inevitable implosion. It wasn't just a small fish. It was a bait fish, a carefully placed decoy designed to draw attention away from the true, deeper currents. As I stood there, the rumble of an approaching locomotive vibrating through the soles of my shoes, the final pieces clicked into place with a chilling precision. The small fish accounts were not merely minor diversions. They were the personal contingency fund of the architect, the mastermind who had orchestrated the entire sprawling network of illicit finance. This wasn't just about the syndicate's wealth. It was about their individual survival, their personal escape route, forged long before the larger enterprise was ever meant to falter. They hadn't just built a system of corruption, they'd built a personal parachute, a private vault of untraceable funds, ensuring their own comfort even as they sacrificed their foot soldiers and destabilized economies. It spoke of a calculated cynicism so profound it left a bitter taste on my tongue. A single headlight pierced the gloom, growing steadily, a cyclops eye bearing down upon me. It wasn't a freight train, but a utility vehicle, a squat, powerful engine designed for navigating the tight turns of the switching station. It slowed, its air brakes hissing, before grinding to a halt a few yards away. The cab door opened, and a figure emerged, silhouetted against the dim interior light. There was no warmth, only a shared understanding of the gravity of the hour. I stepped forward, the heavy briefcase feeling strangely light in my hand. Inside lay the culmination of months of hidden work, coded messages, and sleepless nights. The final, irrefutable proof of the mastermind's personal treachery, their ultimate betrayal of even their own confederates. "This is it," I replied, my voice hoarse, a tremor of exhaustion running through me. "The pre-collapse siphoning. It points directly to their private holdings, their fallback. He didn't open it immediately, merely weighed it, as if sensing the burden of its contents. "This changes everything," he murmured, the words barely audible above the renewed groaning of the rail cars. "It's the motive behind the motive, the final nail." A wave of relief, potent and dizzying, washed over me, threatening to buckle my knees. It was done. The numbers had spoken, the truth laid bare. But beneath the relief, a new kind of tension simmered. The fight was over, but the war, I knew, would continue in courtrooms and corporate boardrooms, a slow, grinding battle for justice. And for me, the world I had known was irrevocably altered. The engine rumbled, then slowly, deliberately, began to move, disappearing into the maze of tracks, its red tail lights shrinking to pinpricks before vanishing altogether. I was alone again, the vast, echoing space of the freight train yard, switching station a silent witness to my solitary vigil. My walk home was a blur of quiet streets and the crisp scent of autumn leaves. The house was a beacon of soft, golden light. Inside, my wife and children were asleep, their breaths soft, and even a rhythm of peace I hadn't truly heard in what felt like an eternity. I stood over their beds, a silent sentinel, the faint moonlight painting their faces with a serene glow. They were safe. That was the only truth that mattered. The next few months were a slow, deliberate rebuilding. The firm, stripped of its tainted leadership, underwent a painful, public purge. Instead, I found myself drawn to a different kind of calculation. A small, non-profit investigative body dedicated to uncovering financial malfeasance in public service reached out. Their work was meticulous, often thankless, but imbued with a clarity of purpose that resonated deeply within me. My first day, sitting at a simple wooden desk, the hum of an old computer the only sound, felt less like a beginning and more like a homecoming. I was still Thomas, the meticulous number cruncher, but I was also something more. I carried the scars of my journey, the quiet strength forged in the crucible of fear and defiance. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was silent and the moonlight spilled across my desk, I would revisit the memory of the freight train yard, switching station. The clanking of metal, the hiss of brakes, the vanishing tail lights. It was a reminder of the precipice I had stood upon and the choice I had made. We had navigated the storm, and though the horizon was still uncertain, it was bathed in the cautious, fragile light of a new dawn. I was no longer merely counting profits and losses. I was helping to balance the scales of justice, one carefully examined ledger at a time. And in that, I found my truest, most profound purpose.